Okay, welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. We are studying Jordan Peterson's Beyond Order, and we are up to Rule 6, Abandon Ideology. That's what we're going to be talking about. The format today is the same that we use. It's highly interactive. So there are 3 sections. During the first section, everybody gets to talk about what they got from this rule. Okay, can take up to 3 minutes to talk about it. Number 2, we're going to do breakout rooms for 25 minutes. There is a set of questions that we have about ideology that we have worked out. So we're going to be discussing those questions in the breakout rooms in groups of about maybe 6 to 7 people. Then is the most exciting part. We come back with the most important thing, and that's the biggest question on your mind about this topic. Okay. And so everybody puts down their biggest questions, and then we do a lightning round of answering those questions, each of the questions one by one. Everybody who wants to answer the question can give their 2 cents in 1 sentence to 5 sentences. All right, so that's the plan. So if you would like to share your takeaways, and I encourage you to do that, because the more you talk, the more you get from this meetup. Go ahead and type ! in chat. Keep on topic, be brief. Feel free to speak your mind, disagree with anybody on anything, and do so courteously. All right. So go ahead and type ! So we're going to start with Claire. Claire.
Thank you, Shrikant. Hi, everyone. So this chapter has a 2-word title. It is simple and it is striking. Abandon ideology. And I have to say, reading this chapter, I feel in this book that this is really the chapter that I've been waiting for. It is well written, it is tight, and it's not a new topic for Peterson by any means. It beckons back to sort of his classic set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world in the previous book, where he brought us inside the minds of the Columbine shooters. This area of expertise for him, this knowledge area of ideology, is really born out of Peterson's long study of some of the great genocides of the 20th century. So if it seems sort of shrill and harsh, I mean, I think anytime we see Peterson talking about these things in his videos, he comes off quite emotional, because to him, this beckons back to some of those great genocides of the last 100 years. So in this chapter, he really more clearly than I think he's ever done before starts to outline why we need to be cautious of any modern idea structures, whether that be yoga or conservatism or liberalism or even like diet culture. He's really starting to beautifully outline how all these kind of modern ideologues are simplifying the immense complexity of the world. And anytime that a school of thought is giving sort of a blanket univariate cause for such diverse and complex problems, where the victims are always innocent, and as he says, the perpetrators are always evil, you should ask more questions there. And he says that these ideas, these are particularly attractive to people who are smart and lazy. And that definitely stuck out to me, because I think I certainly was one of those ideologues in the past. So what do we do instead? What do we do instead of ideology? Where do we look? He really systematically outlines and brings us through the classic Nietzschean thought of God is dead, and what do we do instead of that? And he encourages us to look inside ourselves for the errors of the room. We should sort of look to develop our own value structures, our own idea structures, and take the world's sins onto ourselves, or at least identify what that shadow is within ourselves. He uses the example of fiction. So bad fiction, bad stories, always has good guys and bad guys, but a really good story, it divides each character into light and darkness. It finds the shadow within each of us. And those are the kind of evil characters that we relate to, because we know that, within all of us, there is that propensity to evil, and it's up to us to kind of value or create a hierarchy out of our values. So I will leave you guys with just the last passage of the chapter, which I think is a banger. Have some humility. Clean up your bedroom. Classic Peterson. Take care of your family. Follow your conscience. Straighten up your life. Find something productive and interesting to do and commit to it. When you can do all that, find a bigger problem and try to solve that if you dare. And if that works too, move on to even more ambitious projects. And as the necessary beginning to that process, abandon ideology. Thanks, guys.
Wonderful. Thank you, Claire. Folks, if you want to share your takeaways, go ahead and type exclamation mark in chat. If you would like to share about what is the one thing that you got from this chapter. Okay. Next up is Joe. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I thought this chapter was interesting, and it has a number of different meanings to it, a lot of different layers to it. But there was one quote, and actually, I think, Claire actually referenced it a bit, that jumped off the page for me. It was, beware of intellectuals who make monotheism out of their theories of motivation. Beware, in more technical terms, of blanket univariate single variable causes for diverse complex problems. And the reason, I found that to jump out at me was, one, I don't think it's actually just intellectuals that take single variable causes and make them, their ideologies. I think that can come in all shapes and forms, and like it can come from anywhere, any part of society. It can come from religious. It can come from just the average common man. But by taking a complex problem and reducing it to a single variable, it limits people's ability to communicate with one another. And that's a very important thing, because that's a way of controlling a population, or a group anyway. In addition to what Claire was saying, it also takes away from our own humility, because our humility allows us to reserve judgment. But if you are reducing everything to one single variable, or whatever, however you want to look at the world from one single point of view, then that can't be violated. So you lose your humility in that process, which I think is actually really critical in our own, because it limits our ability to transform ourselves. If you're not humble, you're not open. If you're not open, you're not challenging your own map of the world. So therefore, you're not embracing the unknown. You're not embracing chaos. So in this particular case, it limits your ability to transform yourself. Now, the one thing that I will say is that he says, he starts off the chapter by saying he's addressing something that how he was addressing something that wasn't getting filled in people's lives. I think the problem is that people are becoming more ideological, and as they become more ideological, actually they're in today's world, it's making it impossible for us to communicate with one another. So those are just my initial takeaways. I mean, there's a lot of definite, deep meaning behind a lot of the points that he made. But yeah, those are my initial takeaways.
That's great, Joe. I mean, it reminds me of this entire Uda Loop thing, where you have a conception, and the moment you actually form the conception, it begins to die unless you keep on feeding it and updating it with reality. So excellent point. Next up is going to be Aaron, John, Maritza, Max, and Kevin. Aaron.
Yeah, I really agree with what Claire and Joe just said. I really applaud Peterson from coming up and taking this stance. This is a stance that I've also held for a really long time. I think that ideology is really mental rat poison. And the reason it's like such a pernicious thing for the mind is that it forces the user of ideology to negate everything that is true in order to conform to their ideology. And this is definitely the most pronounced in politics, where you'll see two political pundits, getting into an argument, And just logically, you can see someone's argument just falling apart, but they keep on having to shift the puzzle pieces. They keep having to shift the pieces to make reality fit whatever it is their ideology. And that's why it's rat poison, because it actually teaches us to shut off our mental faculties. It teaches us to basically shut off what it is that we know to be true in order to fit the paradigm or the reality that we've already constructed for ourselves. So I'm glad that Peterson's coming out there. One of the things that I think was missing from the chapter, and maybe it was a bit rushed, maybe we could kind of jump into this in the larger sections, is what exactly is the prescription for fixing this problem? Because I think to get over this hurdle, we're going to need, like Joe said, a lot more communication. We're also going to need a lot more vulnerability. I think to fully overcome this like ideological hurdle, like we're going to have to talk with one another and do that in such a way where we admit that we might be wrong. Like we have to go into interactions knowing like, hey, I'm probably going to be wrong about half the stuff I'm saying right now, and I'm willing to learn. We as a species aren't quite there yet. So I'm wondering what exactly we can do for a species that is still kind of swinging on tree branches and isn't really ready for this kind of level of discourse yet.
Fantastic. Oh, I put that as a question for our lightning round. My favorite quotation on this is by Sapolsky, and that is basically strong opinions loosely held. So you have a strong opinion, but you loosely hold it. A strong opinion allows you to act on it, so which is gives you the feedback that is needed to correct it. Wonderful. Next up is John, Maritza, Max, and Kevin. John.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. I'm probably going to ditto a lot of things that were just said, but yeah, I agree. These issues, as Peterson says, are so complex. I mean, he goes through a whole paragraph of all the different reasons why people might be poor in a society, and he lists about 50 of them. And the ideologies, they lack nuance to such a substantial degree. And as people were saying, if you fit everything into one box, it's really hard to, see the complexity of the problem. And, it made me think about an argument that I had in high school with a Republican friend of mine. And I was very liberal at that point, mostly just from hearing my parents talk about it. And I just remember, raising my voice and yelling at my friend, and being so mad at him for not understanding that if the Democrats just got power, the poor people would finally be helped and all their problems would go away. And, I actually thought that the world was that simple. Like if only Democrats could get in power, our problems would be solved. And just to think about how naive of a view that is now with the more knowledge that I have currently. And yeah, it definitely made me think about a lot of the things in the news today, a lot of the ways that the mainstream media sort of immediately when a story hits, it already has a conception. Oh, this is racism. That was the race of the guy that was shot, and that was the race of the guy that shot him. There's no other explanation that could attribute for that other than racism, without even going into the details and the nuance of the situation. So I agree with the following people. I like the chapter.
Thanks, John. Next up is Maritza.
This chapter very strongly to me just brought back the ideas of what he was telling us in, actually don't remember what rule it is in 12 rules, but the one where he says, make sure that basically he's saying, make sure you're not, casting stones at other people until your entire house is in order. And what struck me about this chapter, and among other things that folks have already mentioned, is he said something to us about the concept of the objective versus the subjective, and an abstraction versus the concrete. And naturally, for those of you who know me, that made me think of the Romantic Manifesto. So Ayn Rand tells us abstractions as such do not exist. They are merely man's epistemological method of perceiving that which exists. and that which exists is concrete. And what I find Peterson is telling us in this chapter is that when we get or allow ourselves to get fully caught up in an ideology, we're floating on clouds of abstraction. And the danger here is we have no solid footing. And as such, we're not able to see reality. But the funny thing is, he also tells us reality cannot purely be objective. So it brings back this concept of balance that we see woven throughout all of his tomes and texts, because another way of saying that we should seek balance is, don't, or be careful that you're not following a false map of meaning. Because at the very core, it's my belief that at the very core of what Peterson is unfolding for us here is that we should pursue that which is meaningful. In my mind, I view that as the banner that sits on top of all of his books. And when we view this admonition to abandon ideology with that in mind, it's that very simple concept of everything in moderation. Don't do anything in excess, including any of your beliefs. Blind faith in anything is a sure way to be walking along the wrong path. I'm not saying I know what's the right path, but I can guarantee you, if you're closing your eyes and you're like, I'm going to follow Sri Kant because he's the smartest person I've ever met and he will never lead me wrong, you are going to fall into a ditch, and there you go. And that's maybe a slight oversimplification, but that's what I'm hearing him saying to us in this chapter, that there's nothing wrong with having a belief. In fact, we need a belief. Nietzsche's lament, because I do view it as a lament when he's saying God is dead, and it's not about God. If you have issues with God, take that out. He's saying that the strong sense of purpose by knowing that one has faith in something is what he's finding to be dead. His lament stems from this choosing to put, I think it's all the eggs in a basket the same. If you decide this is the path and you just stop searching for other potential methods or efficiencies, well then you've taken the easy path and you have stopped searching for ways to improve yourself. And he even puts a little caveat in here where he talks about how you should stop championing for all these great things to start with and start small. And again, what I hear here is that change comes from within. And so when he's telling you to abandon ideology, he's saying, stop trying to solve world hunger. Instead, maybe walk to the corner and help the small little food bank there. Maybe in your mind, that's not big enough. But if you can do that successfully, well, then maybe you go to a bigger food bank. And maybe that's a terrible example, but the point is that we can't change the world by looking at all these huge abstract concepts. We have to bring it down, internalize it, find the small kernels that make sense and put those together, and then move forward a little bit. And if one of those kernels no longer makes sense, don't be afraid to throw it out and pick up another one and keep moving forward, because moving forward, in my mind, is that path towards meaningful life. And that's like the ultimate goal, right? Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Maritza. I want to just highlight one point that you said about like connection between percepts and concepts, because I think this goes to the heart. This is the epistemological issue. So it's really Plato versus Aristotle. Like Aristotle holds that concepts come from percepts, and they are used in order to deal with percepts. So there is this back and forth relationship between percepts, between your experience, between your life and the ideas that you hold. And your ideas are being continuously tested and reworked by your senses and by your actions. This is very different from the Platonic view, which holds ideas to be in a separate realm. So in that sense, Jordan Peterson is profoundly Aristotelian. He's saying that be Aristotelian, there is a connection between ideas and reality. Don't forget that. Thank you. Next up is Max, Kevin, Paul M, and Brian N. Max.
Hello. Yeah. First off, I really like this chapter. I think it was one of the most concrete ones that I read. I'm going to kind of play devil's advocate with my perception of it, because whenever like Jordan Peterson, I think would appreciate us kind of challenging ideas. So one thing that I noticed, I wondered if this kind of thinking would not fall into the trap of, is this too complex to grapple with? Because I noticed him saying this is nuanced. There's all these other things to it, but sometimes you can inject just enough doubt so that people would be like, oh, there's so many factors that, we have to get all this information before we could move forward. I think we actually fall into that trap a lot in society now, the paralysis by analysis kind of thing. Also, it made me ask, is macroism an ideology? I don't think macroism is a word. I just made it up. It means would it be so focused on the small things that maybe you could control that you would then start ignoring the fact of what the group could control, or acknowledge what takes waves in order to change? Because there's been a lot of actual instances in society where there need to be that focus on one thing in order to bring about change. You couldn't say oh, but this one thing has this, that, and that to it, because then we would have just been stuck. There was the civil rights movement. There was other times where you really need to focus on one thing, and then because this house was on fire, and then once this house, you put this fire out, then you could worry about the neighborhood. But you can't be oh, let's make sure that all the other houses are okay while this one house is on fire. There was another instances where, and also changes do come with small groups that are completely focused on one idea. There's been numerous instances of that. Jesus only had 12 disciples, for instance, and then look at what kind of impact that had. There's another thing that I said was there's and also the instance of one person for one thing, and that's been very kind of, there's been a lot of examples of that again throughout history, where those things have been the precipice of the kind of axis of where change in society or whole thought came about. One person very focused on one thing, and acknowledging those houses that are on fire, acknowledging those immediate issues, and kind of ignoring everything else and having that laser focus. So that has been effective in the past as well. And also the biggest one was, I guess, if we abandon ideology as a whole, and then we more take on a kind of Uberman, focus on your own self, become very self-advanced, and then trying to find that common ground. The Uberman concept is equally as flawed as the socialism or communism concept, I feel, because that's also a kind of failed theory from when it was projected, or even when it was tried, until where it's been put into practice. So those were the main things. I just had a lot of questions from that as far as alternatives. I think we brought it up before, but those are the main things that I came up with in this chapter.
Excellent, Max. I love these questions, and we'll have to pick the best of them, because what you're saying is that, for example, that focus requires an ideology behind it. It's you have a certain kind of idea of saying, this is what I need to do, and it creates the motivation, not only at the individual level, but at a group level or a society level, in order to move in a certain way. And that is something that is valuable. And how does this relate to that? So we'll put that as one of the questions in the lightning round. Thank you. Next up is Kevin, Paul M, and Brian. Kevin.
Thank you, Shanka. This is a chapter I read carefully and take most of them. However, that's why, because I think a lot, I'm going to question about Peterson's simplified assumption about wealthy power and masculinity becomes enemy. Obviously, that's not obviously. For example, the wealthy inequality, this problem. I read another video, watch another video. He said we have no answer about it. So obviously put that kind of question if you like. And second, about the power, obviously, I don't care whoever have power. How they use the power is important. How the benefit of the own group or for the big population or for the world. Second one is about Peter states it's like God. However, ideology is dead. Arguably, it's not only God, ideology is not dead. There are more God-like forms or idealism is arise. Facebook, Twitters, even other, isms. So again, I like promised utopian in ideology was attractive, fair-minded people. People needed something blue. He always also maybe that's too far. I don't go to that part here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate that. Next up is going to be Paul, and then it'll be Victor and Brian. Paul.
Everyone. I'll just go ahead and pass. I don't think I can add anything to what's already been said.
Okay, that's fine. So it's going to be Brian, and then Victor and Becky. Oh, it's Penny. Penny, you need to unmute though.
There, now can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, I thought I had unmuted. Okay. I just wanted to say, which probably is kind of similar to what other people said though, but read a couple sentences, where he's talking about like one of the big problems with, being an ideologue. For the ideologue, however, nothing remains outside understanding or mastery. An ideological theory explains everything, all the past, all the present, and all the future. That means that an ideologue can consider himself or herself in possession of the complete truth. And then kind of the opposite of that, which I think is where he's putting in, about like, kind of like, what can we do to solve that problem? Because, people aren't in possession of the complete truth, and, you're going to create a lot of problems if you think that. It is much more psychologically appropriate and much less dangerous socially to assume that you are the enemy, that it is your weaknesses and insufficiencies that are damaging the world, than to assume saint-like goodness on the part of you and your party, and to pursue the enemy you will then be inclined to see everywhere. So to me, that was kind of a synthesis of what he's saying. If these if you think you have a theory that explains everything in the first place, then probably you don't have any problems. It's everybody else that has a problem. And to solve it, everybody else has to do what you think, because that's going to solve it, because you've got all, the answers. But he said that's the opposite of what you really should be doing. What you really should be doing is thinking, well, there's problems in the world and something like that. And, am I actually part of the problem? Am I somehow creating these things, and looking at yourself to try to address it and change yourself, which I think Maritza had said, but, rather than thinking that you've got to change everybody else to what you think.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Penny. Next up is going to be Victor, followed by Becky. Folks, go ahead and type ! in order to line up if you would like to share what you learned from this chapter. All right, on to Victor. Victor, go ahead.
All right. Thanks, Shrikant. So tonight we are discussing sixth rule from Jordan Peterson's Beyond Order book. And it's, as Claire said, it's very simple. It's abandon ideology. And before that, let's quickly look into all the other 5 rules. We started with not to carelessly denigrate social institutions and creative achievement. And then we moved into imagine who you could be and aim single-mindedly at that. Rule 3 is do not hide unwanted things in fog. That's where we discussed sin of commission, sin of omission, and not being clear about our own plans will actually ruin us. That's the idea. Rule 4, notice that opportunity lurks where the responsibility is abdicated. We discussed how picking up responsibility is a good thing. Limitations will actually allow us to grow. And we looked at 2 stories, Peter Pan and Horus and Osiris. One who doesn't take responsibility, and the other one who takes responsibility and goes ahead with courage and achieves what he wants. Rule 5, do not do what you hate. And this particular rule, while discussing, we discussed how doing things that we hate, doing things that we do not want to do now will eventually make us hate ourselves. And tonight we are discussing the idea of abandoning ideology. Before that, yeah, so what is ideology? Claire actually gave a very good introduction to it, saying even yoga or conservatism, liberalism, any kind of ism, it has its own narrative. And they have this blanket univariant thought. They get trickled down to a single variable, as Joe mentioned. And from that single variable, the whole thought forms. And if we agree with that particular root thought, we tend to get enticed with that particular ideology, whatever that is. It usually is very captivating if we buy into that particular thing. And it is very self-serving. It makes the other side bad and our side good. And it feeds into this ego that we are doing good. And it completely blinds us to a critical thought. And we can easily fall into this pit if we don't think what the idea is about. So that's the ideology. But before getting to this, how did we end up with these ideologies? For this question, we have to go a little bit back. If we see ideology as a symptom, there must be a cause for this particular symptom. And for this, Peterson goes a little bit back into the era of enlightenment, and he brings up this idea discussed by Nietzsche, and Nietzsche's famous quote, "God is dead." And most of the people know the quote, but they don't usually know the context of that quote. Nietzsche actually mentions this in a particular illustration, in a particular story that he tells in his book. And let's look at that particular story, because if we don't have that context, it looks like Nietzsche is proclaiming it as a triumph, but he actually is proclaiming it as a tragedy. And let's go into the story. So the story starts like this. It's a very small story. A man running in the streets carrying a lantern in the daylight, and he's running crazy and he's yelling, "I see God, I see God." And the people around looks at him and they say, "Did he lose his way like a child? Why did he get lost? Has he immigrated, or has he gone on a voyage? Or is he afraid of us?" So they try to make fun of him. And then the guy who is running around crazy carrying a lantern, he goes, "Whether is God? I shall tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how have we done this? How are we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon?" Now, that point, entire horizon, wiping out, is a very important point, because there is initially there was a separation between the idea of God, as Maritza was pointing out. We don't have to look closely into the notion of God and define God, but the idea of that transcendence, that difference. So that existed before, but now we wiped that whole thing away. What did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun, sun being the idea of God, and we as earth revolving around the sun? Whether is it moving now? Whether are we moving now away from all suns? Are we not plunging continuously backward, sideward, forward in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not staying as though an infinite nothing? It actually means that there is nothing to aim at. So we are just wandering around. Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night and more night coming on all the while? Must not lanterns be lit in the morning? Do we not hear anything yet of this noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we not smell anything yet of God's decomposition? Gods do decompose. God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we, the murderers of all murderers, comfort ourselves? Who will wipe the blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this dead too great for us? Must not we ourselves become gods simply to seem worthy of it? So that's the postulation of nature. Since we wiped out the difference between the ideal in a sense that we look up to, now we ourselves have to become gods. That's the postulation. Is God dead? It depends how we see it. So is God dead for us? Meaning, if we go into that thought, there is no particular transcendent thing that we look up to. And why did we end up with this kind of thought? And Peterson mentions this particular answer in his book, Maps of Meaning, that we have become trapped by our own capacity for abstraction. We undermine our own belief in the utility and meaning of existence. And Maritza mentioned a very good point that we think in abstractions and we make a mistake of floating in the clouds of abstraction and not connect it to the real world. So that's where we miss the point. And so once we miss that point, then we get into all these abstractions and we form ideologies. And we revolve in ideologies. That's the whole idea of where the root cause of these ideologies is. And this is the context for the quote, God is dead. And that is not being said as a triumph, that is said as a tragedy.
Thank you. Thank you, Victor. Great as always. I love all the quotations. I think that's just amazing. Are they directly from Nietzsche?
That is exactly the story from Nietzsche.
Okay.
Will to Power. Yeah.
Wonderful. Excellent. Next up is Becky. So folks, if you want to share what you got from the chapter, you're welcome to type ! still. Becky.
So this chapter really resonated with me because it detailed so many of my own thoughts that I had to contend with through my existential crisis that spanned a decade. I chose to study mathematics at university because on the path for truth. And what other department would one wish to be if you were trying to find truth? And so it's not I guess over time, my competence in my mathematical reasoning really led to my development of pride. And in an environment where human intellect is revered, it was not surprising that I ended up trading up my faith for the ideology of scientism. And I'm going to read from 173. For the ideologue, however, nothing remains outside understanding or mastery. An ideological theory explains everything, all the past, all the present, and all the future. This means that an ideologue can consider him or herself in possession of the complete truth, something forbidden to the self-consistent fundamentalist. There is no claim more totalitarian and no situation in which the worst excesses of pride are more likely to manifest themselves, and not only pride, but then deceit, once the ideology has failed to explain the world or predict its future. And then, so like Nietzsche, I declared my God as dead. And I guess the consequence of that, which as Nietzsche had pointed out, he had appeared to unquestionably adopt the idea that the world was both objective and valueless in the manner posited by the emergent physical sciences. This left him with the single remaining escape from nihilism and totalitarianism, the emergence of the individual strong enough to create his own values, project them onto the valueless reality, and then abide by them. So the Übermensch, the higher person or Superman, one who can create and decide for himself his own morals. Essentially, we become mini gods through our pride and deceit. And then reality hits, and one is forced to confront the limitations of man. You can't control things that happen in your life, even in the circle of your influence. And good luck trying to control others and their behavior that impact your life. Then factor in the loss of hope beyond the present. I really struggled with like the realization that if this is the only life I have and there is no afterlife, then when that personal suffering overwhelmingly outweighs the minuscule enjoyment of life, there is nothing to justify the pitiful situation I was in. And so one can resort to nihilism or to tyranny. Nihilism, because nothing meant anything, so why prolong the suffering? And tyranny, if I were fueled by resentment and entitlement, in which I would feel justified to enact my version of justice and what I believed was owed to me onto everyone else. And in my case, I fell to nihilism. And fully convinced death was the answer, I awoke in a hospital from my suicide attempts, but with a strong physical desire to live, which really revealed the deceit of my mind. And I had made an assumption, followed through with logic and full conviction, arriving at a contradiction. Therefore, my assumption was wrong. And I had to let my ideology go. I had to come back to the acceptance of God to resolve that cognitive dissonance. And I had to stop betraying my soul and start repairing my conscience. And a month ago, I wrote a poem titled Humility that I'd like to share with the group. Humility. I know what is best, I know what is right. Whatever life throws my way, I'll put up a fight. With every victory, my pride and ego inflate. No one dictates my life, I control my fate. The beginning of my failings causes bewilderment. As manifestations of my limitations bruise resentment. I desperately cling to my belief of self-reliance, denying your existence as my ultimate defiance. But without you, time here is everything. Still, without you, time here means nothing. My logic and reasoning deduce all is meaningless. Rather than delay the inevitable, I embrace hopelessness. As I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you faithfully rescue my soul and preserve my breath. Now I see how my pride has led me astray. God, transform my mind and show me your way. Life has broken me so I can learn humility, to not lean on my understanding nor my ability. As I learn to stand on your wisdom, sometimes I will fall, yet my sins are forgiven as your love covers them all. Thank you.
Wow, that was amazing. That was amazing, Becky. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. It was just amazing. Folks, on that note, we're going to go into breakout rooms. And in the breakout rooms, we have a set of questions. It's actually just constellation of one question. It's about ideology. Question is, what is ideology? Is there such a thing as a good ideology versus bad ideology? Are the 12 rules that Jordan Peterson talks about an ideology? And why is it important to abandon ideology? So what will happen is that the facilitators will pose all these questions, and you can pick up any of the themes, any of these themes that you want to talk about. So we'll run the breakout rooms for 25 minutes. And then we will come back. And when we come back with the best question that you have, okay, and pose that question. So we will get all the questions together, and then we will try to answer all of them in a lightning round. So we'll take a question, and then we will go ahead and have all the, anybody who wants to answer it in brief, all right? I'm starting the breakout rooms now. And again, thank you so much, Becky. That was just amazing.
Communication gap so that their communication can be possible. So I guess communication tips.
Okay, how do you communicate across ideologies?
Yes.
Communicate across ideologies. Very good. All right, next up is Joe. Joe again, go ahead.
Actually, it was really just that last question. It was the same one that Aaron had asked. I wanted to make sure that one got in. So it was the idea of how do we get out of this? How do we communicate across ideologies?
Very good. You mean the first one that he had raised during the first section?
Yes.
Okay, that was, how do we counter the tendency that people have of living, of being ideologues? Very good. Next up is Kevin, Paul, and Victor. Kevin.
Is it possible to transform ideology to shared one rather than abandon?
Okay, can you have shared ideologies instead of abandoning them? Okay. Very good. Next up is Paul. Oh, Paul.
Yeah. How do you avoid becoming like Alice in front of the Cheshire Cat without an ideology?
Okay, just make it clearer to people who do not know as
can you maintain a sense of personal direction without an ideology?
Very good, very good. Personal direction without ideology. Excellent. Next up is Victor.
How do we come to realize if we are stuck in an ideology?
How do we come to realize? Oh, very good. How do you know you're an ideologue? Okay. All right. Okay, so I'm going to start. I'm going to read out all the questions one more time. So let's see here. So first, I'm going to take two questions from last time, from the first session. Erin asked, how do we counter the tendency we have of becoming ideologues? And then Max asked, how do you achieve focus or social cohesive action without an ideology? Then Jyoti asked, how will we unite if we abandoned ideology? Joe asked, what is the difference between ideology or dogma? Next one is, let me see, next one was Erin. He asked, how do you extract the best out of each ideology? Next was Max. He asked, has ideology been ever abandoned in any society? Next one was Maritza. Can you make peace with ideology instead of abandoning it? Next one was Pegor. Is that when an ideology is abandoned, is it simply replaced by another ideology? Christine asked, how do you communicate across ideologies? Kevin asked, can you transform an ideology into a shared ideology instead of abandoning it? Joe, I don't know whether this was Joe. No, it was not Joe. It was Paul. How do you achieve a personal direction without an ideology? Okay. All right. So that's what we have on the table. Let me see, is there anybody else? Jeff.
So it occurs to me that that there's an underlying question to many of those questions, at least partially, which is something like how, since having an ideology seems to be such a strong drive, as you know, in the history of the world and currently, and even very strongly, you know, in these days of great change, is it possible that we could meet that felt need in some other way?
Wonderful. So since ideology is a major long-term human drive, is it possible to meet it? Is it possible to meet that need in some way without having all the negative effects? Okay, so those are the questions that we have. Okay, so let's start with the answers. So folks, the rule, this is lightning round. We're going to go through all the questions. We want to go through as many questions as we can, and we want to get as many answers to them as possible. So the only way to do that is to keep your answers short. So keep it between one sentence to maybe 5 or 6 sentences. So try to be as brief and crisp as you can. First question, how do we counter the tendency we have towards becoming ideologues? If you have answers, go ahead and type an exclamation mark. How do we counter the tendency we have towards becoming ideologues? Claire.
Maybe not counter, but just observe and watch it pass.
Wonderful. Excellent. That's the starting point anyway to changing. Okay. Joe, how do we do that?
I'm totally stealing your answer from Sapolsky. Strong positions, lightly held.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Maritza.
Don't stop asking why.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay. Anybody else? Last chance. Okay. Next question. How can you achieve focus? I'm going to combine it with Paul's question. How do you achieve focus or personal direction or a cohesive action in a group without ideology? Is it possible? How do you achieve focus without ideology? Is it possible? Kevin, Max, and Aaron. Kevin.
Focus what's your need. Then think about what you want.
Thank you. Max.
With this definition, I don't really think so, because this definition presupposes that an ideology is anyone with that believes they have the answer to something that kind of puts themselves as good and other people as bad. So I think basically you would always have to put yourself in the position of, this is what we need to do, this is the good side, and things against it needs to be, at least for a short time, in order to achieve a purpose. So I don't think so, like with this specific definition.
I mean, my short answer to that, yes, it's possible by having strong opinions weakly held. Because you have strong opinions, that gives you the focus. It gives tremendous amount of action based on that. They're weakly held in the sense that you're watching the results of the actions and you're open to all the feedback that you get that will transform them. And what you form again are strong beliefs. So it's like a loop. Next up is going to be Aaron, Maritza, Jyoti, and Joe. Aaron.
Ideas and solutions, but not beliefs.
Wonderful. Excellent. Excellent distinction. Maritza.
No blind faith. I mean, it's okay to have a belief in something, but don't hold on too tight. Be willing to let it go.
Excellent. Jyoti.
Just talk about your experiences, which don't connect with any particular belief system or anything, what you have gone through in life.
Wonderful. Joe.
I think kind of having a coherent philosophy of life that doesn't lead to cognitive dissonance will allow you to counter that. So
Excellent. Next up is, how will we unite if we abandon ideology? How can you have a group cohesion without ideology? Or how do we do that? How is it possible if you abandon ideology? Anybody?
It's not possible.
Okay. Anybody else? Aaron.
Yeah, it's not possible, but we could substitute that for tolerance.
Thank you. Next up is Penny.
It seems to me, with the definition of ideology, but if you have like a belief in something, but you don't consider it all encompassing, like, conservation or something, that you think it's important to try to preserve the world. That's not an explanation for everything that happens in the world, but you could have a group of people that get together and do that without trying to say this is going to solve every problem of the world.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Kevin, Becky, and Dave. Kevin.
Build trust.
Thank you. Becky.
Respect and communication. So the respect um, is given, so then it allows for the communication to be equal in a negotiation kind of form, so that you can operate even with differing beliefs.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Dave.
Emphasize our similarities.
Wonderful. Excellent. Next question. What's the difference between ideology or dogma? Is it the same as Jordan Peterson talks about it, or is there a difference? Joe.
Was kind of from the last one.
You can go ahead to the last one. Go ahead.
Ethical principles was going to be, I think, my answer. So, but it was, as far as with this one, is that the distinction is that dogma you can't deviate from, but ideologies you can. So that's where I think I think Peterson's using ideology and dogma like as the same thing, and that's kind of making it difficult. And at least that's in our chat room. We talked about that.
Excellent. Aaron, Maritza, and Victor. Aaron.
I believe dogma is the component of ideology that has like no useful application. And that's kind of how I would see it.
Thank you. Maritza.
I believe dogma is ideology taken to the extreme. And it's when you find yourself lost in blind faith.
Wonderful. Next up is Victor.
Ideology is a great gateway into dogmatic behavior.
Thank you. Next question. How do you extract the best out of each ideology? Or is that the right way to do it? How do you extract the best out of each ideology? Anybody? Victor.
Each ideology comes out of a necessity to solve a problem, to recognize the problem and not to make it ideal, not to convert it into ideology, but to recognize the problem is important.
Wonderful. Kevin.
I would say each ideology have something in common. It's for good. Take the good part, forget the bad.
Thank you. Dave.
Need to have conversations between each side.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay. One of the ideas that I have is that of having kind of communication between ideologies. So you have these multiple ideologies that are playing against one another. And that's a very powerful way of kind of comparing them at the same time. CJ talks about multiple hypotheses or multiple models, using them at the same time. That provides a way of focusing on the positive aspects of ideologies and ignoring the negative aspects at the same time, because you're stacking all of them and comparing, running all of them together. Next up is, okay, has ideology ever been abandoned in a society? Has ideology ever been abandoned in society?
I guess 19. Oh.
Go ahead, Aaron.
I would say 1989 Russia. Follow the Berlin Wall.
Dave.
I don't know of a specific example, but I think of Maslow's pyramid of needs, hierarchy of needs, that if we're starving, we're not going to argue about ideology. It's when we start, advancing and we start arguing.
Thank you. Joe, followed by Victor. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, just building essentially off of what Aaron had said, not only the Soviet Union, but you can say anything that happened throughout South America, whether it be Chile, whatever, whenever a government's overtaken by another, it's replaced by a different ideology in many cases. So I mean, that's.
Thank you. I cannot resist to tell a story. Sorry about this interlude, but this is a story. A friend of mine was living in Poland when the Berlin Wall came down and when the perestroika started. And he had made a really profound observation. He says, all of us actually hated what was being done to us. But everybody thought that it was only them and their friends who thought that. Moment there was a little bit of freedom of speech, they suddenly realized that, my God, everybody hates this. And then things moved very, very fast. So that's like the dynamic of ideology. You can kind of hold it, but if it is at war with reality, then at some point there is a tipping point. And moment like you have that out in the open, things can move really, really fast. Next up is Victor, Jyoti, and Kevin. Victor.
Yeah, I think as Joe was pointing out, we can abandon a ideology in a particular point of time, but not completely. And also, I don't think it can be done at the level of group. It can only be done at the level of individual.
Wonderful. Excellent point. Next up is Jyoti and Kevin. Jyoti.
Yeah, the untouchables in India, that ideology has been abandoned.
Very good. Next up is Kevin.
Yeah, to follow Srilanka, your story of Soviet Union collapse, it's one sudden they get excited, then later on they realize their life. It should be literally, one example is the military guy, they cannot get the salary. After 20 years, the Putin get back. That's a complete, continuous story.
Thank you. Next up is Nick. You had a comment.
Oh, yeah, that was just on, this is just a concept in complexity science. I was just saying that idea that things can kind of be building for a long time, then you don't really know, or you necessarily always know the trigger, but then suddenly you can see this great unwind that's far greater in magnitude than you'd expect.
Excellent. Next up is Claire.
I was just sort of thinking of like other animal species that are really high in consciousness and have group dynamics, but might not have communication to show some sort of ideology. And certainly they do have overlying value structures that guide their actions and are unspoken, but they're not communicated. So I was just thinking about what we could learn from that.
Wonderful. I'm going to jump to Pegor's question, which is related to this. When an ideology is abandoned, is it simply replaced by another ideology? Anybody? Pegor, what's your answer?
I think given the examples that we've given so far, like the Soviet Union, I think the answer is no, because like everything gets replaced by another ideology so far.
Okay, wonderful. Next up is Nick.
Yes, I think they're also always replaced. I find ideas, and there have been a lot of metaphors drawn to this, is kind of like evolving organisms where there's always going to be something there. And when one dies, another pops up to take its place.
Wonderful. All right, anybody else? Just let's see, John followed by Penny. John.
I think societally, no, but individually, maybe.
Wonderful. Penny.
To me, it seems like when you think about history and all the great social changes, like when they went from monarchy to republics, or even in our country, when we went from having the king to, setting up our republic. I mean, I think those are abandonment of an ideology, but it's replaced always by another one, which is trying maybe to solve things that they thought the other one wasn't solving.
Wonderful. Very interesting. The concept between kind of revolution and evolution, kind of, little changes, making big changes over time versus a big change, big change of gear. All right. Next up is, can you make peace with ideology instead of abandoning it? Anybody? Aaron?
I mean, only if you can abandon the parts you don't like.
Wonderful. Anybody else? Maritza, what do you think?
Read my mind. I think if one stops listening to all the noise surrounding the ideology, if one is true to oneself, and that's kind of a way to break it. I mean, it kind of is like yes and no answer, because if one can choose to not be sucked into the vortex of an ideology, then for you, it's not truly an ideology. But if you're, because like some people are, I have met people who are very religious and they are very true to their faith, but they acknowledge that this is a guiding light for them without being an all-inclusive, all-encompassing framework that binds their life. So I think it's all about balance.
Wonderful. Max?
Oh yeah. Yeah. So in this chapter, I noticed that Jordan Peterson said that with religions, they're kind of redeemed by the fact that they leave space for God as being mysterious, and thus God being mysterious means that there's still some questions or things they don't know. So I think you can make peace with an ideology as long as that ideology has that little room for like shadow of like exception or things they don't know. So as long as it's not like completely all encompassing, and there's like a little space for another set of like values or perspective, especially based off a result. So if this ideology believes something that's not lining up with the results that it's producing, so it being able to actually take that feedback and break the loop. So I think that's the main thing to it.
Excellent, excellent point. Next up is, how do you communicate across ideologies? How do you communicate across ideologies? Kevin?
Agree or disagree? Disagree and agree. Yeah.
Okay. Joe, followed by Maritza. Joe?
Don't discount the other person's ideology.
Wonderful. Maritza?
Take a step back and address things objectively while acknowledging that they are subjective in matter.
Thank you. Max?
I live in Australia, so like here they have like a lot of opposing, ideologies, but everybody's pretty harmonious. And I think it's always the starting point of what we agree on. So everybody starts with what we agree with, and then we kind of build from there, versus starting from like why you're different to me, like why you are similar to me, and then from there where it's easier to kind of build a common ground.
Wonderful. Excellent. And welcome from Australia. I didn't realize you were in Australia.
Yeah, I'm originally from Alabama, but yeah, I live in Australia.
Wonderful. That's quite a distance in every possible way, in cultures, and if you can span those two ideologies, I think that's a good start. Next up is Jyoti. Jyoti.
With patience and respect.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right. I think this is a huge question. I don't know what to say about it, because one of the things is I keep coming back to Carl Rogers' ideas of authentic relating, where you're actually trying to listen to the other people. I think most people actually don't listen to the other people. The moment they notice that the other person has a certain ideology, they stop listening, and they're just actually now dealing with caricatures. So it's like it's separating out from percepts to concepts, and they start using their concepts against the other person's concept, and actually are never seeing the other person. So I think one of the things I see of communicating across ideologies is actually see the other person, because it's actually much more complex, and they have a structure, and you have to bring back all of that to be able to deal anything. And there you will find that there is commonality at some levels, and you can find the differences, and even the other person seeing that you're trying to see them dissolves some of the animosity, so you can actually talk. across the distance. Next up, thank you. Next up is, let's see. Next up is, we already did personal. Okay, we did personal direction. All right, same idea, or is it? Okay, next question is, given that there is this persistent human need or proclivity towards latching on and holding on to ideologies, is there something that can meet that need without all the negative impacts that holding on to ideology produces? Joe.
I'm going to say no, because change is difficult. I mean, that's the whole point, is that's the reason people hang on to ideologies, is because they don't want to let go, and they don't want to let go for a reason. So no, it's not easy.
Wonderful. Aaron.
I'm going to quote a friend of mine here, and he said, if it wasn't for the Super Bowl, there'd be like a world war every 5 years or something. So that's what we can latch on to.
Next up is going to be Kevin, followed by Dave. Kevin.
We can have belief not inclusive, at least not exclusive.
Very good. Dave.
Yeah, I'm going to say something kind of similar to what Aaron was talking about, but I think about the United States. We have borders, but they're just on a map. In Europe, they used to have very firm borders and border guards and visas, and it was impossible to move from one place to another. To me, that's the one reason our country has excelled, is we don't have border guards, although sometimes we used to check for fruit and exciting things like that. But sometime we've got to get over this idea that we have to have borders everywhere.
Thank you.
That a world without borders is, to me, like a world without ideologies. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. I want to remind you that I want to recommend one meetup to you folks, and that's the and one idea, and that is of the Uda Loop. Okay, because for me, that is the best example that I know of, which has been really thoroughly worked out in detail and tested on a massive, massive scale of how do you have your orientation. They use the term orientation instead of concepts or the system of concepts. How do you keep your systems of concepts to be responsive to the feedback that you're getting, so that you can use, so on one hand, it serves as a background, as a base for making decisions and transforming the world based on everything that you know. At the same time, remaining very alert to anything that is out of place, looking for what McLuhan calls the ground of saying, what is there? Joe, can you do me a favor? Can you put the meetup that's on Saturday in the chat?
Sure.
And if you can find the Uda playlist, the John Boyd playlist on our YouTube channel, and if you could put that too. So it's a really profound idea. So it's what it is. Let me describe it to you another way, in a very simple way. What John Boyd held is that there are two processes that you have to engage in relentlessly in order to live, in order to increase your capacity for independent action. That's the goal. Increase your capacity for independent action. You have to do two things. You have to do creative induction and deductive destruction. The first one is deductive destruction. So you're applying the ideas that you know, and you are applying them. to relentlessly. And secondly, you are really closely watching what is going on in the world around you, in the results of your actions, and then inducing from it. So you're relentlessly taking apart your ideas. Instead of holding on to your ideas, you're trying to take apart your ideas. You're trying to combine it with other ideas in order to keep producing better and better ideas that are more responsive to the world and more effective guides to action. So this action component is a critical part of ideas. I think that's another thing. And this is again the insight of Carl Jung: in filth it will be found. So you have to really be able to face up to some really nasty things about yourself in order to make corrections that are necessary, because they will appear as you. Jordan Peterson puts it best: you kind of have to let a piece of you die in order, because that is something that you have invested a lot in, both at the intellectual, emotional, habit level, in terms of people, and you kind of have to let it go in order to do that. And I recommend this, the Uda Loop as a great example. Chet Richard, who is associate of John Boyd, will be there. I'm going to be interviewing him on his book, which he and John Boyd worked on together for many years, of how to apply Uda Loop to business. And there is a whole, on that page itself, you'll find the entire playlist. We have done like 4 or 5 meetups, which are incredible. So I would recommend that. I think that's the best formulation that I've seen of being responsive to the world and not be stuck. So it's, talking about it at the kind of entropy level, what happens is the moment you have a closed system of ideas, it starts to deviate from the world. So it starts to, moment you close it off, it starts to die. It has to be reborn again and again through contact with world, as well as by directing action. So that's the thing. So now, so we have some incredible meetups coming up. This Sunday, we are also, in addition to this meetup with Chet, which is on Saturday at 5 p.m., we have a very interesting meetup on Sunday at 1 p.m. on the ideas of Magda Arnold, who talks about her theory of emotions and reason. It's a very interesting theory, which is based on Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle, of how our ability of making judgment, that your reasoning faculty is actually taking stuff from the perceptual information and shaping your motivations, which are directing your actions. So actually it talks about the same thing, but at a faculty level. What faculty are you using that you need to use in order to be performing this? And this is based on Magda Arnold's theory. We've got Dr. Randolph Cornelius, who has written extensively on Magda Arnold. He's a scholar on Magda Arnold. He'll be here to talk about that. All right, folks. So thank you so much. And Joe, thanks for putting all the links for Uda, and hope to see you folks very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye,
See you,
everybody.
everyone. Thank
Good
you.
night. Good night.
Bye.